to not respond to every instinct and emotion and thought that we have. That's what animals do. And God created us above the animals. Welcome to another episode of Living Life in Tune. I'm your host, Adam Lee. This is the show where we talk about keeping things in tune in our life. Important stuff, man, like faith, love, leadership, personal growth, purpose, all the things that really need to be intentionally developed in our life, keeping them in tune. This is episode number 22, where we're going to talk about what is your high intent. And I can't wait to dive into that content, but really quick, let me put a plug in here. Next week's episode has already been filmed with none other than Ken Lee. That's right, my dad himself. And we sit down and we have a special Father's Day conversation about being dads or being sons and daughters of dads. And it is a wonderful conversation. I can't wait for it to come out and for it to be in your hands. So quick shout out to my dad. Thank you so much. And I can't wait until next Friday. We get to all hear that conversation. So this is episode 22. What is your high intent? See, God created us all with the ability to have a high intent. With everything that we do, we can have a high intent that leads to something else. I was really inspired this past time listening to a podcast by Carey Nieuwhof, episode number 575, and I'm going to butcher this guy's name, Horst Schulze, okay? Horst Schulze. He is the co-founder of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. Ever heard of it? One of the most luxurious places to stay in the world. And the only reason I say it's one of and not the is because Horst Schulze retired from the Ritz-Carlton in his, I think, 60s, and then started a new hotel chain that has now become the most luxurious place to stay in all of the world. And he did that in his retirement. And so it's an unbelievable story about an unbelievable man. And here's what stuck out to me. He has an unbelievable drive in his life because he's driven by a highest intention. He's driven by a high intent. So I'm going to ask you again, what is your high intent? Let me read you a quote from that podcast episode. I will link it in the description so you can listen for yourself. Horst Schulze says, "Excellence is not an accident. It is the result of high intent." Everything that guy did from the time that he was a kid to his age now, building multi-billion-dollar organizations, is he was driven by a high intent. You know what he said in the episode? He said, "We are ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen." And that was his groundwork, his high intent for everything that the Ritz-Carlton ever did and everything that his hotel chain did after that. We are ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen. It's kind of silly that at the end of his show, people were asking him specific questions like, how do I implement excellence in my culture without burning people out and burning myself out? and it's just comical. He just says, you need to have a high intent. You need to realize why you're applying excellence to your organization. And he goes on to say, we were ladies and gentlemen serving ladies. And he's like, we're not servants. We are ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen. He just kept going back to his high intent every single question. So I need to ask, I'm still asking, what is your high intent? This is something that challenges me every single day. And it's also something that I read in the book of the Bible where we read about Jesus. He operated like nobody else with a higher intention. Jesus came to this world with the high intention of dying on the cross for our sins, resurrecting from the dead, and accomplishing the salvation of mankind. He came to earth with the highest intentions, and we see him live his life on earth with those intentions in mind. And the same was true of Horst Schulze. And I want to just say that we are humans. That means we were created. This is what we believe. We were created by God in his image. He made man in his image. So the God of the universe who has the highest intentions created human beings who are also capable of having high intentions. No other creature, we are special. Mankind, humans are special amongst the animal kingdom because we are capable of having a high intent. No other animal can sit down and wonder, like, you've never seen a lizard sit down and wonder, what do I want to do this year? What do I want to do with the rest of my life? No, he created humans with the capacity to have high intent. We can sit down and chart out the course of our entire life sequentially. I want to go to this school after high school. I want to study these things. I want to practice this in the workplace. I want to retire and consult in these areas. And we have the ability to sit down and have high intentions. God gave us that ability. He created us with that ability. He chose for us to have high intentions, and high intentions should drive everything that we do. It should drive our parenting. It should drive our relationships. It should drive our work. High intentions. If someone stops you along the street and asks you, hey, why are you doing what you're doing? You should be able to answer them quick. Like, you know why I'm doing all this? It's because I believe X. It's because, like the owner of Ritz-Carlton said, it's because we're ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen. And I'm going to read down through here how Jesus was asked several questions in a row, and he just kind of fired off, you know what, here's my high intent. Here's my high intent. Here's my high intent. And he lived his life like this. And so we need to take advantage of our capacity to have higher intentions. And it's something we need to utilize and keep in tune every single day. We ought to have high intentions for every area of our life. Let me give you a quick example of one of mine. At the beginning of the year, I was challenged, I believe, by the Holy Spirit to sit down and to write some more music. And music is one of those areas of my life that I'm gifted towards, and I love it. And I don't always do it. So I was convicted at the beginning of the year. I believe that God deposited a high intent in my mind. And basically, I felt this, like, if I write music, it will be great and dandy, but a higher intent will be that I would be able to teach others how to write music, and that through teaching others how to write music, I would be discipling people to worship the Lord. And not only would I be discipling people to worship the Lord, I would also be training new musicians to play music, discipling them to use their gifts to worship the Lord. So Adam, write music, to me was a higher intent. Adam, here's how you're going to make disciples this year specifically. Write some music. And it drove me to write music because of a higher intention of making disciples. And so that's what I'm talking about here today. What is your high intention? So many people just fly through their lives with endless activity, and they're just doing in their job, doing in their marriage, they're doing things, and they don't have a stop and think for a second. They don't utilize their capacity to have a higher intention in mind. Why am I doing these things? What is the things that I'm doing leading to? And so you get what I'm trying to say. Let's read through a couple examples. Actually, they're all found in Mark chapter 2. I'm having so much fun reading through the New Testament with some friends at church. And in one chapter, Mark chapter 2, Jesus is questioned like 4 times in a row about the things that he did. And each and every time he reveals a higher intention. So let me just really quick run down all these questions in Mark 2. You can follow along with me. In verse 5, it says, when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, son, your sins are forgiven. And verse 6, now some of the scribes were sitting there questioning in their hearts, why does this man speak like that? He is blasphemy. Who can forgive sins but God alone? So we have Jesus. You remember the story. He heals a paralytic man, and the people say, why does he forgives the paralytic's sins first. Sorry, I got that backwards. He forgives his sins first. And the people say in their hearts, they say, this is blasphemy. Who can forgive sins but God alone? And Jesus said this man's sins are forgiven because he intended, remember his high intent, he intended to let them know, listen, I am God. I have the authority on earth and the power to forgive sins. And then he says, so that you know I have authority to forgive sins, he turns to the paralytic and heals him. And he says, pick up your mat and go home. And his intention was to prove his power. His intention was to show everybody that he has the power to forgive sins, and that's why he was there. So when questioned, hey, why are you doing the things that you're doing? We ought to be able to just instantly, you know why I did that? It's because I have a higher intention in mind. And the next example, verse 15, if you jump down in Mark 2, as he reclined at the table in his house, many tax collectors and sinners were reclining with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. And the scribes and the Pharisees, when they saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, said to his disciples, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? Well, you want to know why? Because he had a higher intention. He had a higher intention to save sinners. That's why he was eating with sinners. It didn't make sense, but he was doing it because he intended to help the sick. It was not the healthy who needed a doctor, but the sick. And so he answered again with a higher intent. Just like the owner of Ritz-Carlton. Listen, here's why we do the things we do. And they did some remarkable things. You ought to listen to that podcast. He said, here's why. Because we're ladies and gentlemen, serving ladies and gentlemen, and that's why. And Jesus is saying, I came because the sick need a doctor. And that's why you're seeing me sitting here eating with these sinners. Another example, remember, this is all in Mark 2. Jesus is just revealing his high intent question after question. And so it says, now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. And people came and said to him, why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? Well, here goes Jesus firing off a higher intention. And he says, well, it's really simple. He intended to spend time with his disciples and not have to think about fasting in this season of his life. He answered that the bridegroom is here and the wedding guests are experiencing him right now. His disciples, the wedding guests, are experiencing the bridegroom, Jesus, right now. We're not thinking about fasting. There's a higher intention here. And I just love this, man. If you can keep a high intention in the front of your mind, it rationalizes everything that you do. It gives you the ability to just say and explain from your heart why you're doing the things that you're doing as a mom, why you're doing the things that you're doing as a dad, why as a leader you're trying to do the things that you're trying to do, and people have questions for you. Well, there ought to be a high intent in mind. God created you to have that high intention in mind. Okay, one more example. One Sabbath, Jesus, was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain, and the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Why are they eating grain, picking grain on the Sabbath? And Jesus answers with a high intent that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. He's like, listen, I am trying to teach people that I am the Lord of these things. That do you remember David when he got hungry and he was with his men and they ate from the bread of the temple? He is teaching, he's intended to teach them something larger than the traditions of the time. And so that's how he answers. And we see Jesus, the master of the high intent, give us a perfect display of the capacity that God put in every human being to have a high intent, to dream big, to have a passion and a why motivating everything you do. Why do I sit down and write music? Because I know that God will use that to make disciples, to train up worshipers. And every time I don't feel like writing songs, or every time someone asks me like, hey, why do you even dabble in song? It's because of a higher intent. And so we have to still wrestle with the question, but yet it seems that most people still just live their lives with just doing things. You know, they don't have a reason for a high intent for why they're, or they might have a high intent like I'm trying to get to Friday, or a high intent like, oh, I'm just trying to make it to vacation. But what you really realize is people don't have an ultimate high intent like the owner of Ritz-Carlton, or the co-founder of Ritz-Carlton. We are ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen. You don't really run into people too often who have the highest of intention. And I got to tell you, when I do, I absolutely love it. These people inspire me. These men, these women, these leaders who are out here with the highest of intentions and serving people in the most unusual and wonderful ways because of their high intent. It's so inspiring. I want to be exactly like that. I want to have a high intent. But here's the struggle. I'm guilty of it too. We go day in, day out. We live our lives and we don't really have the highest intentions in mind. We're just doing things because they need to be done. We're doing things because they got on the calendar. We're doing things because it's the things that we're responsible to do day in and day out. And we really couldn't stop. We don't really stop long enough to wonder, what is the high intention of this? Why am I enforcing so many things for my kids, right? Let's just take that as an example. Why do I want them to clean their room? Why do I want them to say please and thank you? Why do I want them to treat people with respect? Why do I want them to be able to communicate? Listen, it's one thing to train your kids how to respect and how to communicate, but it's another thing to teach them why you want them to be respectful and why you want them to communicate, that there's an end game far out the present moment. And it's because respectful adults succeed in this world, in this life. It's because people who are on time have more success, and you're training them for their future. Your highest intent is different than sometimes the immediate discipline in the moment. So yet so many people just live their lives just doing things without any explanation, without any reason why. And they're not able to really defend the things that they're doing either. Even if they're important to them, they can't really say or communicate why it's important because they haven't thought about the end game. And I want to say, this is just not how God intended it for us to live our life. This is not what He created us to be capable of. He created animals to just respond to their instincts, okay? If they see something that they're afraid of, their instincts tell them to run. If they're hungry, their instincts tell them to kill and eat. If they're thirsty, they're going to drink. If it's hot, they're going to get someplace where it's cold. If it's cold, they're going to get someplace. God created animals to respond to instincts. We are above the animals. We are human beings created with the ability to have a high intent. We are able to respond to high intentions. Okay, I might be able to withstand some cold weather right now because I have a higher intention of doing something in this cold. I might be able to withstand this hunger right now because I have a higher intention of doing something else. I have a higher intention of losing. We can neglect our animal instincts and respond to a higher intention. And that's what God intended us to do. He intended us to have that ability and to live our lives that way, to not respond to every instinct and emotion and thought that we have. That's what animals do. And God created us above the animals, human beings who ought to have a why and a reason and a passion for a higher intent. We ought to be driven by an end game in our marriage, an end game with our kids, an end game in the workplace, an end game with all of our hobbies, with all of our activities. We ought to be able to say, just like the owner of Ritz-Carlton, listen, here's why I do this in every area of my life. We are ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen. It's so powerful. We have to have overarching high intentions that drive everything that we do. And then we ought to have some high intentions that drive all the little stuff too. And He created us to have these abilities, this capacity. So, if you're listening, I ask you again, what is your intent? What is your highest intent with the things that you're doing, with the way that you're living your life? I got to tell you, pray for me that I don't get in trouble on this one, but I'm already planning on asking my future son-in-law this question. Young man, what are your intentions with my daughter? I just want to know. I want to know what your intentions are, your highest intent. And pray for me. That I hope that might not go over so well, but it's important that we approach everything in life with a higher intent. I want to encourage you to do that. Take advantage of the capacity that the Lord gave you, and go into your life with an end game, with a high intent. Let it drive everything you do. And remember this: your life matters, so keep it in tune.